Korea has been a really fascinating and impressive development story from the perspective of the whole world. In the early 1950s, Korea was mostly an agricultural country. And over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it became one of the fastest growing countries in the world. It achieved a rapid industrialization of the workforce and of production. And then starting in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, Korea started to undergo a process of deindustrialization that was very similar to other cases of deindustrialization that were unfolding across Europe and North America. So for anyone interested in the history and future of work, changes in the kinds of jobs that people have, and roboticization and automation, Korea has just been a very interesting case. And like many other researchers in the field, I've also really looked into Korea's experience with these trends to learn about what's going on there and also what is going on in other parts of the world. Now, one might think that because Korea is so much at the forefront of information technology development, they would also be at the forefront of automation destroying jobs. According to the International Federation of Robotics, Korea has one of the highest ratios of robots per manufacturing worker of any country in the world. It's right there at the top place, essentially. So one might expect that because Korea has so many robots in industry, that Korea would also have fewer workers in industry, in manufacturing, than other countries in the world. But that's not true. And the fact that it's not true is one of the reasons we should begin to doubt some of the story that the automation theorists are telling us. So you might think that the countries that have the highest number of robots also have seen the most deindustrialization, but that's not the case. Countries like the United States, which actually have fewer robots per worker than many of the heavily industrialized countries in Europe and East Asia, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, they're the countries that have seen the most deindustrialization. Countries like Japan and South Korea and Sweden, which actually have many more robots per worker, also have a much higher share of their workforces still employed in industry. So it can't be the case that job destruction in manufacturing is simply the result of adding robots. What's really going on there is that having those robots in manufacturing actually protects jobs in countries like Korea, Japan, and Sweden, because those companies, those manufacturing companies or industrial companies, they're competing internationally in this really hyper-competitive international markets where there's all of these places that have workers who earn much lower wages. And given that heightened competition, it's precisely by bringing in robots that countries like Korea or firms in Korea, as well as in other countries I mentioned, like Japan and Sweden, it's by bringing in robots that those companies have been able to preserve jobs in manufacturing. So that's just one little piece of data, but it should help us think more broadly about what's really going on when we think about the relationship between adding robots and removing people from their jobs. That relationship is never quite so simple. Now, that doesn't mean that adding robots and computers and digitalizing work isn't having massive effects on the ways that work is being done. So one really dramatic change we're witnessing in many countries is the expansion of platform labor and different kinds of mini and micro jobs being accessed through these platforms as some of the only jobs that people can find. And that's contributed very broadly to a process of making workers more insecure, more precarious, making it harder for them to make ends meet, and subjecting them to the rule of algorithms instead of human managers. And I'll say more about that a little bit later in the interview. It's definitely true that these platforms are making workers more precarious, but what researchers have found is that the precarity or the insecurity of workers on the platforms is part of a broader phenomenon of insecurity in the wider labor market. It's because other kinds of jobs aren't emerging or being created that workers are insecure throughout large parts of the economy. And the platform economy is really feeding off of that general insecurity. So what we really need to do is we need to understand, why are workers so insecure? Why are workers not able to find jobs that give them a decent living? And there we need to look at a longer term story. And this is one of the reasons why I cast a little bit of doubt on the automation story. It's not that automation isn't happening. Automation is happening all the time. And when we look at all the technologies we have today, like smartphones and the internet and social media, we can see how much these are changing our lives in general and our work. But what we see when we look at a longer term perspective is actually that technological change, at least in the workplace, which is measured typically by a statistic of labor productivity, that these measures of the pace of change, we actually see that change is slowing down, not speeding up. And as part of a broader phenomenon, countries around the world are seeing their economies just grow more and more slowly. This has affected Korea a lot less than countries like, France or the United States or the United Kingdom, but it's affecting Korea as well. And so the result of this process, which economists call secular stagnation, it's the tendency of economies to stagnate, that's what's causing there to be not enough jobs. And that's a huge problem, because when we think about a capitalist economy, like the economies we've had now for quite some time, those economies really depend on rapid growth to generate jobs and create job security. And as these economies are kind of maturing, and as international competition becomes much more severe, it's been harder for these economies to grow quickly. And as a result, workers are finding themselves more and more in positions of insecurity. And so this insecurity is very real, and technological change is very real. But what I'm saying is that we need to think in a more complex way about the relationship between people's job insecurity and technological change. And the missing factor here is this tendency towards stagnation. Instead of a world in which robots are producing more and more stuff and economies are growing faster and faster and can provide more and more due to roboticization, what we're seeing is that robots are being added when and where they are. Actually, changes in technology in the workplace is happening more slowly than in the past. But the real story, again, is that stagnation tendency. It's the fact that these economies are growing more slowly. And that has big consequences for all kinds of questions concerning politics, the future of work, and what we should try to imagine when we think about the possibilities for a much better future.